in a high-security laboratory, a synthetic biology incubator is humming with low, rhythmic precision. Inside it sits an egg. The DNA code pulsing within that shell wasn't passed down through generations of living birds. It was stitched together by a laser printer using digitized data retrieved from a fragmented, centuries-old museum specimen. This is not science fiction, nor is it a distant projection of the future. This is the front line of a quiet, multi-million-dollar war for the future of nature, happening right now. For decades, the conversation around genetic resurrection was treated as an eccentric billionaire's hobby, a flashy, Jurassic Park-style pursuit to bring back the woolly mammoth or the passenger pigeon just to prove that human ingenuity could conquer time. But a massive, frantic paradigm shift is occurring behind closed doors. Conservationists are realizing that we are losing Earth's living ecosystems so fast that traditional methods like planting trees, breeding animals in captivity, and designating nature reserves are no longer enough to stop the bleeding. The planet is changing significantly faster than evolution can keep up. And so, a radical new faction of science is asking a terrifyingly bold question: what if we stop trying to save endangered species, and instead start using advanced genetic engineering to rewrite them? What if the only way to save nature is to make it artificial? This is the reality of ecological anchoring, a desperate attempt to use synthetic biology as a genetic anchor for dying ecosystems. But tampering with the fundamental, foundational code of life carries systemic consequences that we are utterly, profoundly unprepared to handle. To truly understand why brilliant scientists are turning to such extreme, sci-fi measures, we have to look closely at the sheer scale of the ongoing global collapse. For over a century, the golden rule of conservation has been preservation, protecting habitats from human development, stopping poachers, and letting nature heal itself through its own ancient, resilient processes. But that rule was built on a foundational assumption that the global climate and biosphere would remain relatively stable. Today, that assumption is entirely dead. Coral reefs are bleaching to a deathly, chalky white because marine temperatures are skyrocketing beyond what their biology can endure. Keystone forest species are dying off because winters are no longer cold enough to kill invasive, wood-boring beetles. The environmental guardrails have broken completely. When an ecosystem loses a foundational species, the collapse is rarely localized. It triggers a cascade. If a forest loses its primary tree species, the native insects vanish. If the insects vanish, the migratory birds follow. The entire web of life unravels like a single pulled thread in a complex sweater. This is precisely where ecological anchoring enters the frame. Instead of waiting decades or centuries for a species to slowly, naturally adapt to a warming world, a luxury of time that usually ends in absolute extinction, synthetic biologists are proposing that we jump directly into the driver's seat of evolution. Take the world's coral reefs as a primary case study. They are the marine equivalent of tropical rainforests, supporting a quarter of all ocean life despite covering less than 1% of the seafloor. Yet, under current environmental trajectories, we are on track to lose almost all of them by the middle of this century. Traditional conservationists are painstakingly growing tiny fragments of native coral in land-based nurseries and replanting them by hand onto degraded reefs. It is a beautiful, deeply noble effort, but it is fundamentally equivalent to trying to put out a roaring forest fire with a backyard squirt gun. Synthetic biologists are taking a radically different, aggressive approach. They are mapping the entire genomes of individual corals that managed to survive severe, unprecedented marine heat waves. Once they identify the specific, hypercomplex genetic sequences responsible for thermal tolerance, they use gene editing tools like CRISPR to insert those sequences into vulnerable coral species. They aren't just preserving the coral as it was, they are actively redesigning it to withstand an unforgiving environment that hasn't even fully arrived yet. They are creating a proxy, a genetically modified organism explicitly designed to hold the economic and ecological line, preventing the entire reef ecosystem from collapsing into an underwater desert of slime and rock. On paper, this sounds like an incredible, soaring triumph of human ingenuity. We caused the destruction through industrial carelessness, so we use our highest, most sophisticated technology to fix it. It feels clean, mathematically precise, and profoundly hopeful. But when you step out of the sterile, climate-controlled laboratory and into the messy, chaotic, completely unpredictable reality of the wild, the pristine logic of synthetic conservation begins to crack open. Ecosystems are not machines. They are not grand Swiss clocks where you can simply swap out a broken bronze gear for a shiny, 3D printed titanium alternative and expect the mechanism to tick perfectly. Every single living organism is bound to its environment through millions of years of invisible, hypercomplex, reciprocal relationships. When you alter the genetic code of a single species and release it into the open wild, you are pulling a heavy lever on an evolutionary slot machine, and the payout is entirely unpredictable. Consider the terrifying concept of a gene drive. In traditional Mendelian genetics, an offspring has a 50% chance of inheriting a specific gene from a parent. It is a slow, balanced process that allows natural selection to filter out harmful mutations over vast spans of time. But scientists have developed a powerful, godlike biotechnology that completely bypasses the ancient laws of natural inheritance. A gene drive ensures that a modified trait is passed down to 100% of all future offspring, permanently overriding the wild genome. If you release a handful of genetically altered organisms into the wild, that modified trait will sweep through the entire wild population like a biological wildfire, permanently altering the species within a few short generations. Imagine using a gene drive to make a vital forest tree completely immune to a devastating fungal blight. On the surface, it saves the forest. But what happens if that engineered immunity slightly alters the chemical composition of the tree's leaves? Suddenly, the local caterpillar population can no longer digest the leaves. The caterpillars starve, causing the songbird population to collapse, which allows a completely different, unchecked pest population to explode out of control, destroying the surrounding farmland. By trying to fix one broken gear, we have accidentally stripped the teeth off every other gear in the system. The scale of unintended consequences is astronomical because our understanding of ecological networks is still in its absolute infancy. We are playing a high-stakes game of chess against nature, but we only truly know how half the pieces move. This brings us directly to the profound ethical dilemma that splits the global scientific community right down the middle. If we accept the premise that we can and should genetically anchor ecosystems, we are fundamentally redefining what the word nature actually means. For the entire history of human existence, nature has been defined by its autonomy. It is that which grows, adapts, and exists completely independently of human will and design. The moment we begin releasing gene-edited proxies and synthetic organisms into the wild to maintain specific ecological functions, the wilderness ceases to be truly wild. It becomes a managed park. It becomes a living, breathing artifact of human engineering. If a forest is kept alive only because we have artificially tweaked the DNA of its trees, its soil microbes, its insects, and its predators, is it still a forest, or is it merely a slow-motion agricultural project dressed up in wild clothing? Many traditional conservationists argue that embracing de-extinction and genetic anchoring is a highly dangerous form of technological hubris, a symptom of the exact same human arrogance that caused the ecological crisis in the first place. It creates a comforting, seductive illusion that we can humanly engineer our way out of any ecological disaster without ever changing our behavior. If the general public and corporate politicians believe that biotechnology can simply resurrect a dead species or patch up a dying ecosystem, the political and social urgency to solve the root causes of global destruction utterly vanishes. Why make the hard, incredibly expensive choices to cut industrial carbon emissions, curb corporate pollution, or halt rampant deforestation if we can just wait for a laboratory to print out a new, climate-resistant version of the Amazon rainforest? The promise of a technological safety net risks making us infinitely more reckless with the planet we currently have. It treats the superficial symptoms of our global crisis while completely ignoring the underlying systemic disease. Yet, the scientists on the other side of this fierce debate offer a chilling, pragmatic counterargument that is incredibly difficult to dismiss. They look at the sheer, terrifying velocity of modern extinction rates and ask a brutal question: what choice do we actually have left? Is an engineered, semi-artificial ecosystem worse than a completely dead, barren one? If a vital global wetland is on the absolute brink of total collapse, and the only way to keep it functioning is to introduce a genetically modified amphibian that can survive a newly introduced, human-transported disease, should we really stand by and watch the entire ecosystem die just to preserve some abstract, romantic ideal of pure, untouched nature? In a world where human activity has already altered every square inch of the atmosphere, every single drop of ocean water, and the chemical composition of the global soil, the concept of a pristine wilderness is already a convenient myth. We have already modified the planet through our negligence. These scientists argue that it is now our profound moral obligation to modify it through our intelligence. To fully grasp the complexity, we must look at how this plays out beyond corals. Consider the apex predators and the massive megafauna that shape entire continents. In the high Arctic, teams of geneticists are working to splice elephant DNA with recovered woolly mammoth genes. Their goal isn't to create a zoo attraction, it is to create a cold-tolerant elephant proxy that can clear thick brush, stamp down compounding snow layers, and expose the underlying permafrost to freezing air. They believe this behavior will prevent billions of tons of greenhouse gases from escaping the thawing tundra. It is an eco-engineering project on a continental scale. But the ethical questions multiply the deeper you look. Elephants are highly social, deeply intelligent creatures with complex cultural behaviors passed down from mother to calf over generations. An engineered mammoth proxy born from an artificial womb will have no parents, no social structure, and no ancestral knowledge. How will it behave? Will it violently disrupt the existing Arctic ecosystems, destroying the habitats of migratory birds or native caribou? We are attempting to code for physical traits without any understanding of how those traits manifest in the chaotic theater of wild animal behavior. Furthermore, who decides which species are worthy of genetic resurrection or enhancement? The funding for these projects does not come from neutral, global bodies. It flows heavily from private venture capital, tech billionaires, and specialized biotechnology firms. This introduces a dangerous bias into the future of global biodiversity. A charismatic, famous animal like the woolly mammoth or the dodo receives tens of millions of dollars in research funding because it captures the public imagination and promises massive media returns. Meanwhile, the obscure soil fungi, the microscopic marine invertebrates, and the plain, unphotogenic insects that actually form the true foundation of global ecosystems are left to slide quietly into extinction. We risk creating a designer biosphere, a curated, highly marketed version of nature that prioritizes vanity species over ecological stability. We are projecting our own human biases, consumer preferences, and economic interests onto the canvas of the natural world, rewriting the evolutionary tree in our own image. This tension forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable, historic reality about the immediate future of our planet. We are rapidly approaching a chronological crossroads where the traditional view of conservation will become completely, irrevocably obsolete. We will no longer be asking how we can protect nature from change, because the change is already here, it is entrenched, and it is accelerating daily. Instead, humanity will be forced to choose between two vastly different, competing philosophies of the wild. On one hand, we can choose the path of tragic preservation, accepting that many ecosystems will inevitably collapse, that thousands of unique species will vanish forever, but choosing to let the surviving remnants of the natural world evolve, adapt, and heal on their own terms, free from human programming and interference. It is a path of deep biological humility, recognizing the sharp limits of human knowledge and respecting the independent sovereignty of the living world, even when that sovereignty leads to loss. On the other hand, we can choose the path of the synthetic steward. We can step fully, unapologetically into our self-appointed role as the literal engineers of the biosphere. We can decide that the loss of biodiversity is so fundamentally unacceptable that we will use every single tool in our genetic and technological arsenal to prevent it. We will build massive, frozen biobanks containing the genetic blueprints of every living creature on Earth. We will print new DNA sequences, edit wild populations on the fly using autonomous delivery systems, and use advanced artificial intelligence networks to constantly monitor, tweak, and balance the genetic health of global ecosystems. We will keep the planet green, vibrant, and functional, but it will be a life that exists entirely by our design, our maintenance, and our explicit permission. The wilderness will cease to be a separate realm, it will become a mirror, directly reflecting our values, our technologies, our priorities, and our choices. There is no easy answer to this existential dilemma, and anyone who tells you otherwise is willfully ignoring the staggering complexity of the problem. If we move forward with genetic anchoring, we risk unleashing unpredictable ecological chain reactions that could permanently damage the biosphere in ways we cannot even begin to comprehend with our current science. But if we turn our backs on this technology out of fear, nostalgia, or philosophical purity, we may very well find ourselves sitting in the quiet ashes of a barren, dying planet, wondering why we chose to let the living world perish when we possessed the technology to save it. The egg humming inside that high-security laboratory is a monument to our incredible brilliance, but it is simultaneously a terrifying, tragic symptom of our profound ecological failure. We have broken the world so deeply that we are now forced to consider rewriting the code of life itself just to keep the remaining pieces together. The true, ultimate test of the 21st century will not be whether we possess the godlike power to edit the code of nature, it will be whether we possess the collective wisdom to know when to put the pen down.